So thank you everyone for being here. My name is Jessica Loride. I'm the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And our mission is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. So tonight, our program is entitled Hate at Home, Anti-Semitism and Why It Matters Today. And we have two speakers that will be sharing this information with us. And the first is Jodi Elowitz, who's the Director of Education and Engagement for the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. She has worked as the Minnesota after serving as the Executive Director of the Tennessee Holocaust Commission and the Director of Holocaust Education for the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Our second speaker this evening will be Jackie Congedo, who is the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the public affairs arm of the Jewish Federation of Cincinnati, which works to ensure Jewish security by building a more just society for all people. Before her work in Cincinnati's Jewish community, Jackie spent 8 years as a broadcast journalist working for stations in Washington, D.C., Lexington, Kentucky, and here in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I am going to hand it over to you, ladies. Thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to the program.
Thank you very much. And it's always my pleasure to be here with Jackie. Jackie and I do this presentation together, so it'll be somewhat of a conversation between the two of us. And then also we encourage you to put questions in the chat, or you can wait until the end of the program and we'll definitely take questions because we're sure you're going to have them. So I'm just going to quickly pull up the PowerPoint right now. And as mentioned, this is Hit It Home, Anti-Semitism and Why It Matters Today. And we're focused on, not just the historic anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism in our world today and how it plays out in our city of Cincinnati, but also how it plays out across the state of Ohio and also in Kentucky. So what is anti-Semitism and why does it matter? It's what known as the longest hatred, and I'll talk about that a little more in the historic section, but it's known as the longest hatred. It's been around for a very long time. The word itself is rather new in terms that it was coined in 1879 by a gentleman named Wilhelm Marr, who was a German journalist who was trying to put forth his ideology of Jews and hatred for Jews. It literally stands for hatred of Jews, but quite honestly, it was designed in terms of starting to think about Jews as a race, which it is not. And Jackie and I will talk a little bit more about that later. But it is on display today. And as we go through this presentation tonight, you'll see the many ways that it has manifested itself in our current times. So Jackie, I'm gonna let you talk about who are the Jews.
Yeah, thank you. And Jessica and the Interfaith Center appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this topic, which I think is in some ways so misunderstood and continues to sort of peak in our consciousness as a society in headlines and in different sort of watershed events. And so we're hoping really, as sort of piggyback on the introduction that Jodi gave, to peel back the curtain a little bit and help everyone understand really what this is about, what makes it different than other forms of bigotry, how does it intersect, why is it relevant outside the Jewish community to understand and know how to address this. And obviously, as Jodi said, to take questions. No questions are off limits. We've heard them all, so we encourage you to speak up and ask your questions. When we think about, how to understand anti-Semitism, really we have to start with a better understanding of who Jews are. And if you were to ask an average American audience, who is someone who's Jewish, they would probably say they are someone who believes a certain set of beliefs, right? They're just like Christians believe a certain set of Christian beliefs, and Muslims believe, are adherents to Islam. Jews believe believe Jewish belief and practice Judaism, and it's a religion. Of course, we know that actually being Jewish is about much more than religion. Some people subscribe to the religious, doctrine, Judaism as a religious doctrine. Some Jews actually consider themselves Jews of no religion. So this explains how you can have someone who's Jewish who might not believe in God, who might be atheist. You can have Jews make up a culture, an ethnicity. Now there's a component of sort of national identity with sort of the modern reemergence of the modern state of Israel. We are not a race, although that's a conversation that really has come up recently. Many of you may have heard the remarks that Whoopi Goldberg made about the Holocaust several weeks ago on The View, talking about how the Holocaust wasn't about race. And unfortunately, this just illustrates how misinformed we are as a society about Jewish identity and about frankly, the construct of racism, which is something that has evolved and changed throughout time and has been, who is white and who is not white or how race has been classified and sort of implemented has evolved depending on the society that's where it's being used. And so in 1930s Germany, Hitler was campaigning on the basis of Jews being a separate race. We know obviously not to be true, but to make the statement that the Holocaust wasn't about race, that's where this became problematic. And it goes back to, again, who are the Jews? Jewish identity predates the concept of race. It predates the concept of religion. It predates the concept of ethnicity. So we try to sort of put it in any one of these buckets, and that falls short as it relates to Jewish identity. I think that's really important to remember. It's got this sort of multifaceted identity. Another way I explain this is, when I take a 23andMe test, and I did, my dad's Italian Catholic, so it comes back as half Italian and half Ashkenazi Jewish. So there is this element of ethnicity, of shared history, of lineage that plays into what it is to be Jewish. There's also a religious component. As you can see here, we are a very diverse people, 14.7 million Jews in the world today, which is only 0.2% of the global population and 2% of the American population. And we look like people from all over the globe. There are Jews in Ethiopia, there are Jews in Argentina, there are Jews in the Middle East and in sort of, the Far East. So, we have a very stereotypical idea of someone being Jewish as a white person with a religious identity, when in fact, Jews can look like anyone around the world and may actually identify well beyond or actually outside of religious Judaism. So I think those two things, particularly that, when we think about the idea of Jews and whiteness, it's problematic to think of Jews exclusively as white people without any sense of sort of marginalization and actually sort of blanket labeling Jews as white ignores the unique experience of Jews as outsiders and as a persecuted group. And also we tend to think about Jews as a religious group, and that also ignores the multi sort of dimensional aspect of Jewish identity. So bridging from that into a conversation more about sort of what anti-Semitism looks like today. If we go to the next slide, you'll see we can look at the story of what anti-Semitism looks like today through numbers and through stories that people tell us. And so if you look to the left, the ADL, this is from a recent survey that the ADL took of American Jews, asking if they've experienced or observed any of the following experiences. And you can see that almost 1 in 10 people who were asked reported that they had been physically attacked because they were Jewish. That's probably far more than you might expect. And you can see going on up to 63% who experienced or witnessed some form of an anti-Semitic incident, whether that's graffiti or vandalism or harassment in schools or bullying, language, Also, we can look at anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. These are incidents that have been recorded by the Anti-Defamation League. I should note that they are not the same as FBI hate crime statistics. FBI hate crime statistics is the data that is reported through police departments to the FBI that is categorized as a hate crime. The ADL records more broad. We know, by the way, that the FBI data is dramatically underreporting the actual situation. The ADL records all incidences that are reported to them, also through law enforcement channels that are motivated by anti-Jewish bias, basically. And so we have a better idea of really what's out there when we look at the ADL data, better than the FBI data. We will look at the FBI data later in the presentation, but just to give you a feel, that's the difference between the two numbers. And here you can see that, unfortunately, the numbers have trended up in the last several years. We see from in the early part of after the turn of the century, actually anti-Semitic incidents were on the decline in the United States. And then in 2016, they spiked by a third. 2017, they went up further to 57%, almost 60%, basically doubling. 2019 saw nationally the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record since the ADL began keeping track about 4 decades ago. And then in 2020, we continue to see it sort of level off at this number. And I'll also mention that in Ohio, actually the number continued to climb. In 2020 was the record year. So you'll see that in a minute. And there's a lot, I think, at play there in terms of where we are positioned in the United States and sort of the unique confluence of factors here and different groups that are active here and what that means in terms of anti-Semitism. I'll just draw your attention to the left side, the other two blue columns there on the left of that anti-Semitic incidents in the United States portion of the slide. This just shows, and we'll talk more about this later, that there is a connection between what happens in Israel and the experience of American Jews as it relates to anti-Semitism. So if you see here, there was a 115% increase in anti-Semitic incidents during the last 2 weeks in May of this past year versus that time frame the year prior. What was happening the last 2 weeks in May this past year? Israel was engaged in armed conflict with Hamas, which is the terror group that occupies Gaza. And so this was happening abroad, completely separate from any Jews in other places around the world. Israel was doing what it had to do to defend its citizens. And regardless of how you feel about that, in the United States, there was a huge increase in anti-Semitic violence against Jews, everyday Jews, not Jews at Israel rallies, not Jews holding Israeli flags, Jews like a gentleman wearing a Hebrew shirt, walking near University of Cincinnati's campus who belongs to a Jewish fraternity, who was literally had fast food thrown at him out of a moving car with people screaming, "Stop killing Palestinian children." This guy had nothing to do with what was going on overseas. He was the victim of an anti-Semitic incident because there is this conflation of people who are opposed, obviously, to what's happening with, to the actions of the Israeli government and take that out domestically on American Jews or hold them accountable. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about how different manifestations of anti-Semitism, what it looks like on the far right, far left in some of these intersectional justice spaces. And so I'll remind you to kind of come back to these numbers to see that, in fact, this is a real problem. I think sometimes it is overstated, but the numbers do back up that it is a problem.
And we probably should mention, Jackie, too, that these numbers are based on what is reported. So that's something important to think about, too, that the incidents have indeed spiked, but people also are reporting more of these incidents than ever before as well.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's true. So, the numbers have, what we see here in terms of like inflation and not inflation, but rise in the numbers can't be solely attributed to people reporting more, but I think that people are definitely reporting more. And that's because there's a broader awareness and people are paying more attention, which in some ways is a good thing, but it's not good that there's stuff to pay attention to. In Ohio, you can see the picture is bleak and worse actually than on the nationally speaking. You can see that anti-Semitic incidents in Ohio, this is what I was mentioning, are up 72% from 2019 to 2020. So quite a significant rise in just the last year. or the last year that we have data for, I should say. And you can see, across the board in all different categories of incidents, they're way up. Just a note about two things. This was 2019 to 2020. You remember 2020, we were all, and many of us are still locked in our basements. And so this continued to persist, and in fact, even went up when there weren't people occupying synagogues and day schools and things like this. That also shows the persistence of anti-Semitism, that it really mutates not only in the way it manifests, but also, the platforms. This, the incidents online incidents up 400%. White supremacists and others sort of finding new ways to attack the Jewish community and to express their anti-Semitism, in some ways actually more fertile ground online. And then also, just to note that Kentucky and Ohio top the charts for white supremacist flyering. We see this across the board. I'll show you a few examples in a minute, but at local universities, even at local bookstores, we had a group, I'm assuming it was a group, but an incident where there were anti-Semitic flyers tucked in books at Joseph Beth. Someone came in and actually took the time to do that at a bookstore. So, we know that in some ways we're a hotbed for this kind of thing. There are a lot of sort of, white supremacist neo-Nazi groups that are active in sort of the tri-state, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Southwest Ohio region. And it's unfortunately not getting any better out there. This is, again, what I was talking about, when we say, what does it look like? These are some of the examples. On the top left, this is right before the pandemic hit. This is the bridge crossing over Madison Road near Crossroads Church. And there is the graffiti basically is one of the oldest anti-Semitic allegations that, the Jews killed Christ, and attributes it to, the New Testament, the Gospel of John. Obviously, this is a sick, twisted interpretation of events, and rooted in sort of one of the oldest anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of deicide. But yeah, that was brazenly spray painted in huge letters across a bridge trellis in our city. The white supremacists fly in the middle. This is typical of what they do. This is a group called Patriot Front, and nothing, you might walk by this and say, like, for the nation. Okay. Yeah, like, I'm all about, like, national pride, America first, all of that. Unfortunately, you look up Patriot Front and they are explicitly anti-Semitic and racist in their ideology, but they masquerade around as America first, and, if you're patriotic, you'll stand with us. And so they're able to recruit a lot of people in that way. I think this was at Northern Kentucky University. This is a flyer that was posted. We deal with a lot of incidents in schools. These range from harassment of kids, just names, name calling, swastikas on playgrounds, to things as aggressive as actually like orchestrated assaults on kids' social media pages where, kids will have their, like, one young man had his track photoshopped so that he was actually in a concentration camp scene instead of in his track outfit on the track field. And, we work closely with the Holocaust and Humanities Center to help schools respond to these things and to sort of intervene in ways that hopefully help kids understand how to do better next time, and to create a more tolerant school environment. The bottom, so the one that's a tweet, actually the two tweets, I should say, are both unfortunately from elected officials or folks running for elected office. And we have seen a huge uptick in this, particularly associated with Holocaust misappropriation related to vaccine mandates and to public health policy. So, in Northern Kentucky, we had a sitting congressman who actually now twice has made grossly inappropriate Holocaust comparisons to, to vaccine policy. And we have a candidate right here in Ohio for Senate who happens to be Jewish and continues to talk about how, the way Democrats are handling public health policy is reminiscent of Nazi policy in Nazi Germany, which is just couldn't really be further from the truth. In the bottom corner, and then I'll move on, is this was a gentleman with the sign that has a rat on it, and what the sign says, the real plague, and it's a rat with a yarmulke and a Jewish star. So this is obviously the one of the oldest anti-Semitic conspiracies, theories in the book, that, like, Jews are responsible for public health problems and the plagues and things like that, associating Jews with, like, pestilence and disease. And so this man came to, this was right outside of the Capitol, the state capitol, during the protests over the shutdown that Governor DeWine and Amy Acton mandated right at the beginning of the pandemic. He showed up with this sign. We were able to get pictures of his face, and our security folks helped to identify this person. Turns out 2 weeks later, he showed up in a convenience store near Kent State on the anniversary of the Kent State shooting, in full-on like combat gear with Nazi tattoos, with a machete, asking the clerk where he could find Jews. So we were able to put the pieces together, and he was actually arrested on an unrelated, another warrant, an outstanding issue, and is serving time now on that issue. But it goes to show you that, you know, you might see something like this and think it's harmless. This guy was trying to insert his narrative of sort of Jewish conspiracy, right? Like Jews are somehow to blame for these circumstances, and you can really project that over any circumstances. There are so many different actors who have used that conspiracy theory. But in this case, saying like Jews are to blame for the pandemic. And it's not that everybody outside the State House felt that way, but he knew that this was fertile ground to sow this conspiracy theory among a group of people who felt like the elites were holding out or they'd been disenfranchised. And so he was very much trying to seize on that opportunity of scarcity and people who are already driven by fear to recruit. And he clearly was very dangerous. He was serious about what he was projecting. So we have to, you know, we're in a position now in the Jewish community where we have to take this stuff very seriously when we see it. As we talk about anti-Semitism in America, it's important to note this contradiction. So on one hand, you might be like listening to all of these numbers and stories and thinking like, why this stuff is kind of serious. Like, why hasn't this registered for me before? Or like, why is this surprising to me? And the reason is because, on one hand, if you look at the pie chart on the left, actually, let's start with the temperature chart on the right. So on one hand, we know from surveys that have been done that by and large, people report not having problems with Jews. In fact, not just not having problems with them, actually feeling pretty warm or liking Jews. If you ask folks, and this was in 2017, you can see the 2014 and 2017 data, and I don't know that it's changed very much, although I'm not sure that Pew has done a more recent study, how warm they feel about Jews, they will tell you they feel about 67 degrees towards Jews, which is warmer than Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelical Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, on down the line. We are, by and large, the most favorably regarded religious group in the country. At the same time, when we look at, this is the FBI data that I was mentioning, when we look at the FBI data of actual reported hate crime across the country, 60% of all religiously motivated hate crime targets Jews. So 60% of all religiously motivated hate crime is perpetrated against 2% of the American population. That's the percentage of the Jewish population in America. Which might surprise you. I mean, look at the anti-Muslim hate crime, right? It's almost, I don't know, I can't do the quick math in my head, 3 times, almost 3-4 times that. It's actually more than all of the others combined. So it's hard for us to register that anti-Semitism is a real problem because, by and large, the way it exists in conspiracy theory and stereotypes, it allows us to say we feel okay about Jews, but really anti-Semitism is actually alive and well, particularly in many extremist movements that pose real threat to minority communities, to our democracy. Jill, I will answer your question in just a second. Who's the source of the current slide? So on the right, it's Pew. The Pew Research Group did the study of attitudes towards religious groups in the United States. That was in 2014 and 2017. And on the left is the FBI hate crime data. So this comes straight from the FBI. And this has stayed, by the way, pretty consistent year to year. I believe this specific data is like probably about a year old now, maybe, but it has not moved from 60% in many years. Yeah, no, you're welcome, no problem. So we have this like trouble holding these two competing things in our brains. that there is a real specific, deadly, oversized threat to the Jewish community from anti-Semites and anti-Semitism. Yet, most people, when you ask them, don't know what anti-Semitism is, can't really identify it, can't understand it, and certainly don't consider themselves to be harboring of any anti-Semitic beliefs. Just an important distinction to point out. On the political spectrum, as I mentioned, this can look like everything from sort of, contemporary manifestations of neo-Nazi ideology. We see that in this portrayal of Amy Acton puppeteering Governor DeWine. Our public health commissioner, former public health commissioner, is Jewish. And so someone literally photoshopped her face onto this cartoon of Pinocchio and Geppetto. And the idea of sort of the Jews as the puppeteers, the behind the scenes manipulators, is like basically the core of the anti-Semitic conspiratorial lie. And here it is, and it has been used for centuries to persecute and target Jews. Here it is in current day. A lot of people ask, okay, so I get the neo-Nazi thing. I can kind of conceptualize what that is. Like, what does it look like on the left? By the way, when I say left and right, I mean fringe left and right. I'm talking about extremist actors by and large, although it is creeping its way towards the center more and more these days. But I don't want anybody to feel offended. I'm talking about them in the right or the left. I'm talking about extreme right and left politics. So on the left, we see really two things. One is this idea that, Jews are white, a white religious group. And so, we are not, because of our whiteness, and again, that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that's a misrepresentation of the Jewish community on many levels. But the idea, this belief in certain left circles that the white, we are part of the oppressive force, right? Either sort of reinforced by what's happening with Israel and Palestine, but also that, we are in control of government, and media, and have a lot of power power and agency and in the United States. And so this idea that we're part of that enemy sort of oppressor in certain rights movements that exists. And we see that play out on college campuses where like Jewish students are afraid to wear their kippot, right? Their skull caps, or their, Hebrew shirts in places where, where there are other struggles for rights. And they're told, like, basically hide your Jewish identity or don't come. And then also, as it relates to Israel, again, as I mentioned, on the slide that showed what happened in May, we do see instances where what happens in Israel affects how American Jews are treated. And, how can we distinguish what is sort of fair critique of Israel and Israeli policy and government from what's anti-Semitic? There's really three ways to distinguish those things. One is when Israel is demonized, so not just criticized policy-wise, but actually sort of held accountable as like the demon. Again, anti-Semitic stereotypes. Israel is the Jew among nations, right? It's like the demon. It's the world's biggest problem. If Israel disappeared, all the world's problems would go away. So if it's demonized, if it's delegitimized, so basically, the idea that Jewish presence in the land of Israel is a farce, that Israel is a colonial enterprise that just sprung up and everybody came there after the Holocaust. The idea of Jewish indigenousness to the land is delegitimized. That tends to raise our concerns about anti-Semitism. So demonized, delegitimized, and then a double standard applied. So this is when, Israel is hyper focused on in forums like the United Nations for, their treatment of Palestinians or for Israeli government policy, when in fact there are egregious human rights violations happening in many places throughout the world. None of them are held accountable the way that Israel is repeatedly sort of targeted in that way. So again, you can be a fierce and unrelenting critic of Israeli government and policy. You open any Israeli newspaper and you will read it up and down. They are not shy about engaging in democracy over there. But when it starts to look like anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes, when Israel is delegitimized, demonized, or held to a double standard, that's an indicator that there may be something else going on that we have to pay attention to. The picture at the bottom here of the gentleman ripping up the Israeli flag, I think illustrates sort of the left and the right issues. So this was actually in Dayton. This was on the courthouse square in Dayton. There was a KKK rally happening on one side of the fence, obviously not a friendly place for Jews. On the other side of the fence, this was going on. And these were folks who were there to protest the KKK presence. And among them was a guy ripping up a flag with a Jewish star on it. Excuse me. You can see how if Jews wanted to participate, like which side is friendly for Jews? Neither, really. I think I'll leave it there. If there are questions, we can come back to more of that. And I'll pass to Jodi to talk a little bit about the history.
Thank you. So I think it's important now to think about like where we are now, but where does this all come from? Where does it begin? And for us, at the Holocaust and Humanities Center, a lot of times people think anti-Semitism began with the Nazis, but that's not the case. The Nazis used anti-Semitism to help push forth their ideology and to create Jews as an enemy, as an other, as a parasite. This notion of Jews as plague bringers, or in some Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda to be equated with rats. So that rat imagery is something that, as Jackie said, has been around for a really long time, but the Nazis really played off of that in their own propaganda campaigns. Like I said, it's the longest hatred. We don't know exactly we can't really exactly pinpoint when it begins, but we do know that it has been around for as long. Some scholars pinpoint anti-Jewish feelings and attitudes all the way back to Egypt. Where it really starts to play out, and these stereotypes and the tropes that we deal with today really begin in the Middle Ages. You can see here this woodblock print that's from the Nuremberg Chronicles that came out in the late 15th century, in which Jews will fail to convert to Christianity, and so there is nothing more to be done than to burn them at the stake. And this is based on some some writings from the time. So, you have three forms of anti-Semitism. One is in terms of religion, anti the Jewish religion, and then in the late 18th century, early 19th century, you have this sense of Jews as a social, economic anti-Semitism, in which Jews are scapegoated for problems in various societies. And then in the 20th century, you have the Nazis who come along and they really racialize anti-Semitism. They're the ones who put forth this notion that Jews are somehow a race, and they are a race, an impure race, a race that is a problem. And so that is where it comes from. And what I would like to do now is, if Jackie, are you ready to pull up I'd like to show you a video of Rabbi Lord Sachs from 2018, in which he is addressing Parliament. And this particular video will frame why anti-Semitism today needs to be watched, why it is important to all of us. So I will let us play that, and then we can go back.
So grateful to Lord Popat for initiating this debate, and I want to explain why. The greatest danger any civilization faces is when it suffers collective amnesia. We forget how small beginnings lead to truly terrible endings. 1,000 years of Jewish history in Europe added certain words to the human vocabulary: forced conversion, inquisition, expulsion, ghetto, pogrom, Holocaust. They happened because hate went unchecked. No one said stop. My lords, it pains me to speak about anti-Semitism, the world's oldest hatred, but I cannot keep silent. One of the enduring facts of history is that most anti-Semites do not think of themselves as anti-Semites. We don't hate Jews, they said in the Middle Ages, just their religion. We don't hate Jews, they said in the 19th century, just their race. We don't hate Jews, they say now, just their nation state. Anti-Semitism is the hardest of all hatreds to defeat because, like a virus, it mutates, but one thing stays the same. Jews, whether as a religion or a race or as the state of Israel, are made the scapegoats for problems for which all sides are responsible. That is how the road to tragedy begins. Anti-Semitism, or any hate, becomes dangerous when three things happen. First, when it moves from the fringes of politics to a mainstream party and its leadership. Second, when the party sees that its popularity with the general public is not harmed thereby. And three, when those who stand up and protest are vilified and abused for doing so. All three factors exist in Britain now. I never thought I would see this in my lifetime. That is why I cannot stay silent, for it is not only Jews who are at risk, so too is our humanity.
So as you can see, he makes a very powerful statement, and he sums it up, I think, very nicely. The scholar Deborah Lipstadt also says, anti-Semitism might start with Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. And we'll talk about that more as we move forward. The next thing I want to talk about is where does this notion of the shadowy Jewish figure come from? Where does this conspiracy-minded theories and stereotypes come from in terms of Jews controlling all aspects of life? It comes from this pamphlet called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's not really a pamphlet, it's like a book. It's a book. But it came out, it was written in Russia. It was first published in around 1903. And it didn't really pick up legs until about 1917. And the reason for that, of course, is because it's the Russian Revolution. The actual content was written in terms of taking people's minds off the crimes of the czars. And so they wanted to equate, this is the first time Jews are equated with Bolshevikism. And of course, this is played out in various scenarios even today. It's a hoax. It has been always known as a hoax. It's been exposed as a hoax over time, and yet today it's still, this conspiracy theory holds up even today. You can purchase this, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion still. It is very, it's been manifests itself every now and then in the Middle East. And it's problematic in terms of the fact that it is the foundation and basis for all conspiracy theories that we have in the world today. Here you see the cover of the French version of the Protocols, in which a Jew is portrayed as a sinister spider controlling the world. You see the Jew as a sinister figure, and you can see on his hat or on his kippah, there is a sense they're equating him to communists. Anti-Semitism is not rational. You cannot both be a communist and a capitalist. There's all this duality that goes on. But this is where we get the majority of conspiracy and notions about Jewish people. The other thing that is important to understand is how does it get from Russia to the United States? What happens is this particular book is brought to the United States by the industrialist Henry Ford. He serializes it and publishes it in his newspaper that he owned, the Dearborn Independent. So that is how this starts to come into play into the United States. Because as you can see, the Rabbi Lord Sachs is talking about Britain. So this is not an isolated problem just to the United States. This is a worldwide problem. This is worldwide anti-Semitism. And in the global age that we live in, it's even more extreme with the use of the internet and social media platforms. This kind of hate goes around the world very quickly. And so it's something that we really do need to, need to pay attention to. Off of this, we do have what's known as the dog whistle. Many of you have probably heard this in terms of conversation. And really, the terms that come to mind are internationalist, globalist, cosmopolitan, and all of it is directly related to the protocols of the Elder of Zion. So it is to try to make the Jews look like they have no loyalty to where they live, that they somehow have a larger loyalty to either the state of Israel or to each other. But we also know that that is not true. Globalist is very much like an internationalist. This notion that Jews have that they're it's a global conspiracy, if you will. And this notion of cosmopolitanism, in which you're thinking of Jews as urban dwellers. And so these are the kind of things that you'll hear to trigger that you're talking about Jews, in a conspiratorial way. You see here in the images that I collected here, you have, George Soros as a figure about this Jewish figure behind Black Lives Matters or any kind of immigration policy, anything that people, problems that we may have that we don't have solutions to. You have the Rothschilds who were, in the 18th century and 19th century were looked to as we look to George Soros now, that somehow the Rothschilds, as Jews, were not loyal to any country. They were loyal to the dollar. And you can see here that this cartoonist has, you can see that somehow that these horrible groups, these terrorist groups, are all suckling at the pig of the Bank of Rothschild, so that the Jews are behind all of these various agencies. And, we know that that isn't really the case. Again, here you get this notion that Jews are the shadowy figures ready to betray the nations that they live in. And that somehow Jews are dirty, corrupting influence on good and pure people. All of these are taken from ancient anti-Semitic tropes. And one of the most troubling things that we deal with is the notion that somehow at the end of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism stopped, that it was over. But the truth of the matter is there was extreme anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. The Holocaust did not stop anti-Semitism. How do these histories all play out? Where are these intersections of history? We do know that the Nuremberg laws that were created in 1935 to completely segregate Jews out of German society, they were no longer considered German citizens. All of this was based on looking at other laws in other countries. And one of the laws, the countries that the Nazi lawyers who created these laws looked to were the United States. They were very fascinated by the Jim Crow segregation laws. And so they based a lot of what they put into the Nuremberg laws on those Jim Crow segregation laws. The Nazis were also very fascinated with immigration law, this notion of keeping good people in and bad people out. And of course, the immigration law of 1924, which established the quotas, basically kept out the Jewish refugees seeking safety in Germany in the 1930s. So Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. So there's that complexity. And then also the other thing that they were very interested in was how we treated our indigenous population. They were fascinated by this notion of manifest destiny, and they used the notion of manifest destiny in terms of how they went into Eastern Europe and in the Soviet territories. So all of these things are intersected. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. These things all play off of each other, and there is a thread. And then Jackie, I'm gonna turn it back to you to talk about how these intersections of hate are now playing out in our world today.
Thanks, Jodi. Yeah, so I want to just first address, I believe it was Barry's question about the 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 presence of anti-Semitism in sort of some Christian, I would say, interpretations of New Testament. So the notion that Jews are to blame for the death of Jesus is an anti-Semitic conspiracy lie. Hard stop. So and I, sick and twisted. I just think anti-Semitic conspiratorial lies in general are pretty sick and twisted. This was not meant to say in any way that Christian tradition or Christian faith or theology is sick and twisted, but the idea that that comes out of some interpretations of Christian scripture that Jews were to blame exclusively, right, for the death of Jesus is just plain old not true. And when you understand the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, which is, here's something that happened that disenfranchised us, that we don't like, that makes us upset, and we're going to scapegoat this one group for it. We're going to pin it on this one group. It's easy to see how that is a version of anti-Semitism. This idea, and again, this deicide idea that Jews were to blame exclusively for the death of Christ. We know that this happened, in the Roman occupation, right? There were Romans who were who would routinely crucify people. There's a lot you could read about why this is false, but that's what I meant there. Not in any way that Christian teaching or theology or religion is in any way sick and twisted. Obviously, we work side by side in partnership with our Christian friends and neighbors, and we have so many allies in the Christian community, and it's in no way to say that if you believe in Christianity, you or the faith is inherently anti-Semitic. That's
No,
definitely not
absolutely not. And it's a very complex history, and it has to be examined over time. We can't like hit all the nuances of how all of this comes out in 45 minutes to an hour. I mean, this is like centuries and centuries of different doctrine, but also thinking about how civilizations change over time and how religious thought changes over time. So yeah, that it's a lot bigger than we can ever like examine in this evening.
Thank you. Yeah. But I'm happy to have a further conversation about it, or we can send you more resources if that would help in clarifying. I'll sort of move us forward to the present. So Eric Ward is a contemporary civil rights scholar and activist. He has spent a good part of his life actually studying white supremacy and white nationalism, specifically the social movement of white nationalism and what motivates it, what underpins it, what drives it. And he, again, as a Black civil rights leader who is not Jewish, has been screaming from the rooftops for longer than people would listen over the last 10 years that we have to, in order to adequately address the threat of white supremacy and the threat that white nationalism poses to our democracy, we have to understand anti-Semitism. And the reason for that is, Jodi, do you have that clip pulled up? I might just let him sort of share it if you have it.
I certainly will.
So I'll let Eric share sort of the theory.
All right, so Eric has disappeared. Why does that do that? Hold on one moment and I will bring Eric back. There he is.
Is he being elusive?
He was being extremely elusive.
Anti-Semitism isn't at the core of white nationalism. It is the core of white nationalism. So central to this present-day form of white supremacy that Black people and other marginalized groups will not win our freedom unless we are actively engaged in uprooting the specific form of anti-Jewish hate. Among 21st century white nationalists, Jews are cast in a role that they have always filled for anti-Semites, an absolute other, demon stirring the pot of lesser evils, a driving force behind white dispossession. At the foundation of the modern day movement is an explicit claim that Jews are a separate race. Their ostensible position as white, the greatest trick the devil has ever played. Jews, despite and indeed because, are an enemy race that must be exposed and eliminated. This fantasy of invisible Jewish power explains how Black Americans, a supposed inferior race, could orchestrate the end to Jim Crow. Feminists and LGBTQ people could upend traditional gender roles, and how workers could mount a challenge to global capitalism. When folks ask me, where is the anti-Semitism in the white nationalist movement? It's everywhere. When the Tree of Life shooter says Jews were committing a genocide against white people, he was using language that was intimately familiar to his fellow white nationalists. Such rabid anti-Semitism forms the framework upon which the entire movement functions. To refuse to deal with any ideology of domination is to abet it. Fighting anti-Semitism cuts off the driving force of white nationalism for the sake of all marginalized communities. Visit westernstatecenter.org to learn how to educate your elected officials and to hold their colleagues accountable.
So that's a lot to digest, and we're happy to share that link afterwards or take questions about it. But the essence of that is that, you know, he is as a Black civil rights leader, actually, when he was studying this movement, attended one of these white nationalism conferences or gatherings. And one of the organizers approached him and said, "I'm so glad that you're here because we're trying to diversify our movement against the ultimate enemy, which is the Jew." So the idea that people where, you know, communities of color, LGBTQ, Muslims, immigrants may stand the most to lose if white nationalists have their way with our country. In many ways, their ideology sort of hinges on anti-Semitism. This idea that Jews are actually the reason the reason for the you know, the browning of America, as they would say, or the dispossession of white people in America. And as Eric said, in fact, because we are seen as white, we're able to sort of work in our whiteness to make this happen. Obviously, that strips people of color and feminists and LGBTQ and Muslims and others from the agency that they are entitled to in, like, to their oppressors and winning. It dehumanizes all of us. So, and that's really what he says here, you know, that he hears all the time that he's some kind of puppet, that, you know, somehow he's being controlled by Jews to say these things as a Black leader. And you know, that's anti-Semitism at play. You can see the theory that he shared in this contemporary cartoon. This was circulated during the Black Lives Matter protests. This Jew, you know, the maniacal Jew, literally controlling the Black robot, right? And making that basically saying the reason the BLM movement's successful is because, literally, I heard this, George Soros funded it. George Soros, the Jews are behind this. So it helps to kind of tune into these things when we hear them, because they don't seem explicitly anti-Semitic when we hear them. But when we understand the ideology that underpins it, when we understand that this is actually a conspiracy theory, it's actually functions more like a conspiracy theory than just you know, sort of a prejudicial hatred. It's easier to understand when it's at play. You could say the same for what happened in Texas. You know, when this guy who picked a synagogue over a mosque, over a church, over a movie theater, any other place to make his demands, not necessarily because he hated Jews, although who knows how he actually felt about Jews. He picked a synagogue because he thought he was drinking the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews could somehow get him what he wanted. Jews had the control over government, could talk to each other across states. He wanted the rabbi at the congregation in Texas to call the rabbi in New York like they had any relationship or would know each other. But he was believing this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews were to blame for what happened in this case to this person who was imprisoned for you know, for what happened overseas, and that Jews could fix it for him, could get him what he wanted. So when we have our radar tuned better, we can see it in different places. And I think, as Eric says, it's really important for all of us, not just because of, the right struggles, but also, anti-Semitism can function in many ways. It has throughout history as sort of an alternative to engaging in democratic practice. When we feel disenfranchised by, the elites are holding out, my vote doesn't matter. The power is going to be manipulated regardless of what I do, right? And we scapegoat Jews for those issues. We actually don't engage in the hard work of fixing the problems, of examining the complexity and the issues, why these things are hard to solve, and doing the work of democracy to fix them. So it doesn't end well for anyone, unfortunately, and we've seen that throughout history.
And it should be pointed out that this meme that we're seeing, this was something that went around on January 6th, the day of the, January 6th last year. So that's also important to consider as well.
Yeah.
And, give you this one.
Yeah, so Eric mentioned this, in Charlottesville, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And that's because white nationalists basically say the Jews working behind the scenes to dispossess us, white people, will not replace us, white people, with people of color, with Muslims, with LGBTQ, with immigrants. So, it's not that Jews themselves will not replace us, although they may mean that as well, but it's that Jews will not be the replacers of us with these other groups of people, right? And you can see, you scratch below the surface. This is what Eric also goes on to say. You scratch beneath the surface of many of these hate motivated crimes, and you will see anti-Semitic ideology at play. So, as he mentioned, the shooter at the Tree of Life synagogue attacked that synagogue during a refugee Shabbat. He was really mad that immigrants, about the immigration issue in America, and he thought the way to fix that issue, get what he wanted, was to get rid of Jews. Yeah. So I will, I think, leave that there. I know there was a question in the chat about, there's a couple of things. One is about Whoopi Goldberg and also anti-Zionism, which is a worthwhile. I know we are out of time at 8 o'clock, but I don't know if there's time to answer those questions or what you'd suggest, Jessica.
Yes, we can take a couple of questions, maybe just the two that are in the chat since we're running low on time, but let's do that.
Sure. So I can start in, or maybe Jodi, do you want to take the one
the
about
Whoopi
Whoopi?
Goldberg?
And I'll take the anti-Zionism. Yeah.
Yeah. So with Whoopi Goldberg, Whoopi made a statement about Jews. So she basically kind of was also her thought process was based on, not that I want to be clear, not that Whoopi Goldberg is an anti-Semite, but what she said was more about how she thought Jews were white and that the Holocaust was really about white people fighting white people. And then it was pointed out to her that no, it was about race. And then she was confused because she didn't think Jews were a race. She thought it was a religion. And so her statement, was incorrect. It was historically incorrect, that she also got that whole history wrong. And that, one of the things that I felt disappointed about was, instead of having her suspended, it would have been better to have someone like Deborah Lipstadt come on The View, or have somebody else who's an expert on anti-Semitism or an expert on the Holocaust to come on and explain it. I thought that would have been the better way. It could have been a really great teaching moment, because a lot of people don't understand this complex history. They don't really understand, what the Nazis were doing, how they used historic anti-Semitism and racialized it in order to create Jews as a race. And that was the explanation in terms of how they went about exterminating, their policy of extermination. And so that's something that, she just didn't understand. So that's really what we were talking about with the Whoopi Goldberg situation.
Yeah, and I'll add to that that, Whoopi was coming from a place of like an experience of a Black woman in America where
Indeed.
race means a very particular thing to her. And, she's not wrong to say that um, if a guy in a KKK hood passes her and someone who's Jewish, white and Jewish, do Jews in America, white Jews in America benefit from white supremacy? 100%. So she wasn't wrong in the fact that she was speaking from in her own context of race. She was missing the historical perspective that Nazis um, regarded Jews as a separate race,
And
and
they
that
also,
race has been a malleable concept throughout
right,
time.
and also too, race in America is based on skin color. Like that's how we understand it. But also, you have to understand the white supremacists don't see Jews as white; they see Jews as people of color because they're equating. We've been talking about how Jews are that shadowy figure behind people of color, but they also equate Jews with people of color. So that's another complexity that isn't quite understood, especially in how the United States views race.
Yep, yep. So I'll move us to this last question, and actually I think I can answer the other one that was in there in the course of this. This has to do with anti-Zionism. Is anti-Zionism implicitly anti-Semitism? Are they separate? So to Andy's question, I think it depends on how you define Zionism. And the definition that I use of Zionism is the Jewish people's right to self-determination within some boundaries within the ancestral homeland of Israel, the ancient homeland of Israel, the Jewish people, right? So if you say you are, in my mind, if you say you're anti-Zionist, that means you are against the fundamental principle that Jews are entitled to determine their own destiny. That they are entitled to a national identity, grounded where they have lived forever and ever since ancient times. And that is not a right that is not afforded to it's afforded to so many other groups. So why aren't Jews entitled to that? Now, some people want to. I think Zionism has been sort of redefined in some ways, and I think incorrectly redefined in more modern times to say, you're a Zionist if you support Benjamin Netanyahu's version of what Israel should look like, or you're only Zionism means Israeli occupation in the entire land of Israel with no Palestinian state. I don't feel that that's Zionism. So, can you be anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic? I think it depends on your definition of Zionism. And I think that's one of the issues is we're all not clear on one definition. We haven't as a society, I think, had that conversation about what Zionism is. But in my book, if Zionism is just affording Jews the right that every other people has to security and self-determination within a homeland where they have had historic presence for centuries and centuries, if you're inherently against that in any form, it's hard to make the case that there isn't some anti-Semitism in that when it's afforded to just about every other people. I hope that helps. And then so this we could have a whole other hour conversation about, but the BLM movement and the Women's March. First of all, I do not think the Black Lives Matter, the movement, is inherently anti-Semitic. I get that question a lot. Black Lives Matter is a movement that is hyper local, many different chapters. Each chapter is led by their own sort of local leadership and their own principles. Were there certain national platforms in the movement for Black Lives? There was one national platform I'm speaking of several years ago. One of the pieces in a big platform was an anti-Zionism principle. Was that problematic? Yes, it was problematic for the reasons I just stated. But I don't think that the movement of expressing that Black Lives Matter, saying that, or the movement of it is inherently an anti-Semitic movement. I think it is rooted in justice. It's a very particular form of necessary justice that we have in this country, which is to uproot and end racism and racial in pursuit of racial equity. I think it's a worthy pursuit. And I think that we as Jews honestly have to get like a little bit more comfortable in the space of educating others about what is Jewish, what is anti-Semitism, what is anti-Zionism. we've been operating as people who are seen first as white and next as Jewish in this country for like our entire existence in this country. And so there's a reckoning happening in the Jewish community about the fact that now, we have to be super aware of our identity, and we have to get back in touch with our own marginalization to help other people understand it. So that's the BLM thing. The Women's March, similarly, there was actually leadership in the Women's March that sort of refused to disavow Farrakhan. Farrakhan is the Nation of Islam leader who has, this actually goes beyond Israel. This is like, this guy has put out there publicly in sermons that Jews are cockroaches. It is sort of a virulent anti-Semite, I can confidently say. He also has done amazing things for Black empowerment, for like, uplifting Black families, for Black communities and who have been victimized by the plague of gun violence. And so in this case, you had leadership at the Women's March who had been very personally touched and sort of lifted up by the Nation of Islam and by Louis Farrakhan, and who refused to denounce him because he had done really amazing things for her in a very personal, painful time in her life, having to do with losing her, her first love to gun violence in the streets. And so again, it's not super clear cut. Is what Farrakhan says problematic and anti-Semitic? 100%. And in these intersectional spaces, BLM, Women's March, there has to be a broad definition of who is allowed to be at those tables. And I think that's where we've gotten sort of a little crossways is, when you start saying these forms of oppression are allowed here, but these aren't, or, you're allowed to participate, but if you support the state of Israel, or if you identify as Jewish, then you're an oppressor and you don't belong. This litmus test stuff is really dangerous for these movements that are supposed to be inclusive. So that's I think the challenge there. Really good questions though, and I'm happy to follow up offline with anyone else who has more.
Great, thank you. And Jodi, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nope. I thank you all for letting us come and present this important material to you this evening. And of course, if you have any questions, I agree. Jackie and I are always available to answer questions. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And thank you everybody who has watched the program. Thank you for educating yourselves. And thanks to both of our speakers for being here. I want to also let you guys know Monday, the 28th of February, we will be having another program on Taoism. And on Wednesday, March 9th, we have a program on Confucianism. And for both of those programs, we have a couple of the most educated folks on the subject, some of the top scholars in that field to discuss both Taoism and Confucianism. So I hope you'll join us then. And everyone, thank you again for being here.